In the vast tapestry of human memory, few stories possess the enduring power of the Exodus. It is a tale that has echoed through millennia, passed from generation to generation like a flame carefully tended against the darkness of forgetting. Children learn it at their mother's knees. Scholars debate it in hushed library halls. Artists paint it on cathedral ceilings and carve it into stone. Musicians compose symphonies that attempt to capture the thunder of hoofbeats and the crash of waters. Yet at the very heart of this ancient drama stands a figure both central and mysteriously unnamed. The biblical texts speak of plagues that turned the Nile to blood, transforming the lifeblood of Egypt into something dark and terrible. They tell of frogs that covered the land like a living carpet, their croaking voices drowning out human speech. They describe swarms of gnats that rose from the dust like tiny tornadoes and flies that darkened the sky in writhing clouds. They recount hail that fell like stones from heaven, locusts that devoured every green thing, and darkness so thick it could be felt, pressing against the skin like velvet curtains drawn across the world. Through all these supernatural visitations moves the figure of a stubborn ruler, a man who watched his kingdom suffer rather than release his Hebrew slaves. He is described as proud beyond measure, his heart growing harder with each divine demonstration of power. He makes promises in moments of crisis, only to break them when the immediate danger passes. He becomes the embodiment of earthly authority set against heavenly command, the ultimate symbol of power that refuses to bend even when faced with forces beyond human comprehension. But nowhere in these sacred pages will you find his name carved in the memory of Scripture. He remains simply Pharaoh, as if the ancient scribes chose to strip away his identity, to make him symbol rather than man. This deliberate anonymity creates one of archaeology's most tantalizing puzzles. In a civilization obsessed with preserving names for eternity, where royal cartouches adorned every available surface, and scribes recorded the smallest details of court life, this silence feels almost intentional. Consider the contrast with other biblical rulers. When the texts speak of Nebuchadnezzar, they name him explicitly, describing his conquests and his madness with vivid detail. When they mention Cyrus of Persia, they celebrate him by name as the anointed deliverer who freed the exiles. Egyptian pharaohs appear elsewhere in biblical narratives with their identities intact. Shishak is named when he raids Jerusalem. So is the pharaoh who gives his daughter to Solomon in marriage. But the greatest pharaoh of them all, the one whose confrontation with Moses shapes the foundational story of Jewish liberation, remains nameless as the wind. This anonymity has sparked centuries of speculation and investigation. Medieval Jewish scholars pored over ancient chronologies trying to match biblical timelines with Egyptian king lists preserved in fragmentary papyri. Christian theologians in Alexandria and Constantinople debated the identity of this mysterious ruler, seeing in his fate a divine lesson about the dangers of opposing God's will. Islamic historians, drawing from their own traditions, proposed various candidates based on genealogies that traced back to the earliest dynasties of Egypt. But human nature abhors such mysteries. We are creatures who seek patterns, who connect dots even when the lines between them exist only in our imagination. We find faces in clouds and hear voices in the wind. We create stories to explain the unexplained and impose order on chaos. And so, across the centuries, each generation has proposed its own candidate for the nameless pharaoh, each theory reflecting the knowledge, assumptions, and desires of its time. The Renaissance brought new tools to this ancient puzzle. Humanist scholars gained access to Greek and Latin texts that had been lost for centuries. They studied Manetho's Egyptian chronologies, preserved in the works of later historians. They compared biblical genealogies with the king lists carved on temple walls. Armed with improved mathematics and a growing understanding of ancient calendars, they calculated and recalculated, trying to pinpoint exactly when the Exodus must have occurred. The Enlightenment added archaeological evidence to the mix. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 brought back not only military reports, but detailed drawings of monuments and inscriptions. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone unlocked hieroglyphic writing, suddenly making readable thousands of texts that had been silent for millennia. excavations began to uncover the physical remains of ancient Egyptian civilization, providing tangible evidence that could be measured, analyzed, and dated. Modern researchers, armed with radiocarbon dating and satellite imagery, have proclaimed discovery after discovery. Each new technology brings fresh possibilities for investigation. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried structures without disturbing the soil above them. Chemical analysis can determine where ancient materials originated. DNA testing can reveal family relationships among royal mummies. Computer modeling can reconstruct ancient landscapes and predict where important sites might lie hidden. Walk into any bookstore today, and you will find shelves lined with confident proclamations. Ramses II, declare some authors, pointing to his massive building projects that employed countless workers. His reign lasted 66 years, longer than any other pharaoh, providing ample time for the events described in biblical narratives. The cities of Pithom and Ramses, mentioned in Exodus as Hebrew construction projects, seem to echo his name and building activities. His mummy, discovered in 1881, shows signs of rapid mummification that some interpret as evidence of an unexpected death. Amenhotep II, insist other researchers, noting his military campaigns that brought thousands of captives from the Levant back to Egypt as slaves. Inscriptions from his reign describe victories over Asian peoples using language that seems to parallel biblical descriptions of Hebrew bondage. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings was found to contain multiple royal mummies, creating mysteries about why so many bodies were gathered in one place. Some see in this evidence of a dynasty disrupted by divine judgment. Thutmose III, argue still others, citing his expansion of Egyptian power that coincided with what many scholars consider the most likely time frame for biblical events. His stepmother Hatshepsut ruled as pharaoh for 22 years, creating political tensions that might have made the kingdom vulnerable to internal upheaval. His military records speak of campaigns in Canaan and Syria, regions that would later be associated with Israelite settlement. Each theory arrives wrapped in its own compelling logic. Archaeological evidence is marshaled like witnesses in a court case. Ancient inscriptions are quoted as testimony. Dates are calculated and recalculated until they seem to align with biblical chronology. The passion of the believers is genuine, their scholarship often impressive. They cite respected Egyptologists, reference peer-reviewed studies, and point to museum displays that seem to support their conclusions. Yet something remarkable happens when we step back from the excitement and examine these claims with the cool eye of scientific method. The patterns begin to blur under closer scrutiny. Evidence that seemed crystal clear reveals unexpected ambiguities. Inscriptions that appeared to confirm specific theories prove to have alternative interpretations. Dates that seem to align perfectly shift when new calibration methods are applied. This is not failure, but the natural process of good scholarship, the way truth slowly emerges from the careful sifting of evidence and hypothesis. Real archaeology moves slowly, methodically, testing each conclusion against multiple lines of evidence. It publishes results in journals where other experts can examine the data and challenge the interpretations. It builds consensus through repetition and verification rather than through dramatic announcements and media attention. Consider the emotional weight these identifications carry for modern seekers. For millions of believers across different faith traditions, the Exodus represents far more than a historical event. It speaks to fundamental questions about divine justice and human freedom. It addresses the relationship between the powerful and the powerless, the oppressor and the oppressed. Finding the tomb of the Exodus pharaoh would not merely solve an archaeological puzzle, but provide tangible proof that these cherished stories rest on solid historical ground. This longing for connection between faith and fact creates its own complications in the search for truth. Evidence becomes filtered through the lens of desired outcome. Ambiguous findings get interpreted in ways that support predetermined conclusions. The natural caution of good archaeology, with its careful qualifications and measured statements, gives way to the excitement of apparent discovery and the certainty that sells books and fills lecture halls. In this mixing of hope and hypothesis, the line between what we can prove and what we wish to believe becomes dangerously thin. Documentaries present theories as facts. Popular books make claims that exceed what the evidence can actually support. Internet forums buzz with discoveries that professional archaeologists view with skepticism or outright dismissal. The result is a landscape where genuine scholarship competes with sensationalized speculation for public attention. Yet archaeology has its own kind of romance, its own way of revealing wonder that needs no embellishment. When a team of excavators carefully brushes sand from a pottery shard, when radiocarbon analysis dates a piece of ancient wood, when satellite imagery reveals the outline of a structure buried for thousands of years, something genuinely magical happens. The past speaks across the millennia with its own authentic voice, telling stories that no amount of wishful thinking could invent. The tombs scattered across Egypt's desert landscape hold their own testimony, written in stone and preserved in the dry air of the necropolis. In the Valley of the Kings, where limestone cliffs shelter the burial places of pharaohs, archaeologists have uncovered chamber after chamber filled with the remains of ancient rulers. Some bear elaborate inscriptions proclaiming their deeds to gods and men. Others lie empty, robbed in antiquity of their golden treasures, but still whispering secrets through the artifacts left behind. Still others surprise researchers with unexpected discoveries that reshape understanding of entire dynasties and historical periods. But none, despite decades of careful excavation and analysis conducted by teams from universities around the world, has yielded the clear, unmistakable evidence that would identify its occupant as the biblical Pharaoh of the Exodus. No inscription declares in hieroglyphic certainty, "Here lies the king who hardened his heart against the God of the Hebrews." No artifact bears witness to plagues that supposedly devastated the kingdom. No skeletal remains tell the tale of a ruler who perished in the waters of a miraculously parted sea. This absence of evidence is itself profoundly significant. In a civilization that documented everything from tax records to royal hunting expeditions, from temple offerings to military campaigns, the silence surrounding any potential Exodus pharaoh speaks volumes. It suggests either that the events unfolded very differently than traditional accounts suggest, or that the stories evolved and developed over centuries of retelling, gathering mythic power and symbolic meaning that transcends simple historical documentation. As we begin this journey through the landscape of claim and counterclaim, of passionate belief and careful skepticism, we must remember that the greatest archaeological discoveries often come not from confirming what we expect to find, but from remaining genuinely open to what the evidence actually reveals. The desert sands of Egypt guard many secrets still, buried beneath millennia of wind-blown dust and human forgetting. Some may yield to patient investigation and improved technology. Others may keep their mysteries forever, adding their silence to the great conversation between past and present. Popular claims about discovered tombs and identified pharaohs spark natural curiosity and excitement in all of us. They tap into our deepest human desires to connect past and present, to find tangible proof for the stories that have shaped human civilization. But as we will discover in the chapters ahead, when subjected to the rigorous methods and careful scrutiny of modern archaeological science, many of these exciting claims begin to crumble like ancient papyrus exposed to the harsh light of the desert sun. The digital age has transformed how archaeological claims spread across the globe, creating an environment where dramatic theories can achieve worldwide attention within hours of publication. Social media platforms, YouTube channels, and online forums have become battlegrounds where amateur researchers present bold identifications of biblical figures, while professional archaeologists struggle to provide measured responses to increasingly sensational assertions. Among the most persistent modern claims are those surrounding the alleged identification of specific pharaohs as the ruler described in Exodus narratives. These theories typically focus on three main candidates: Ramses II, Amenhotep II, and Thutmose III. Each identification comes with its own set of supporting arguments, photographic evidence, and interpretations of Egyptian artifacts that promise to solve one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. The case for Ramses II as the Exodus pharaoh has gained particular traction in popular media, supported by his association with the biblical cities of Pithom and Ramses, mentioned in Exodus as Hebrew construction projects. Proponents point to his 66-year reign as providing ample time for the events described in biblical narratives. They cite his extensive building programs that would have required massive labor forces, potentially including enslaved populations from conquered territories. More dramatically, some advocates claim that Ramses II's mummy shows physical evidence of the plagues described in biblical accounts. High-resolution photographs of the preserved pharaoh have been analyzed by amateur investigators who claim to identify marks consistent with divine punishment. Dark spots on the mummified skin are interpreted as evidence of boils from the sixth plague. Damage to the wrappings is attributed to supernatural intervention rather than natural deterioration over millennia. Professional Egyptologists who have actually examined Ramses II's mummy provide very different explanations for these supposed plague marks. The dark areas identified by amateur researchers are recognized by trained pathologists as normal results of the mummification process, natural discoloration from thousands of years of aging, or shadows created by photography. Medical analysis reveals that the pharaoh died of natural causes consistent with his advanced age, showing no evidence of sudden death or disease processes that would support theories of supernatural punishment. Similar claims surround the mummy of Amenhotep II, whose tomb in the Valley of the Kings has generated numerous theories about its potential connection to Exodus events. Amateur researchers have focused particular attention on what they term anomalous burial practices in KV 35, interpreting the presence of multiple royal mummies as evidence of a dynasty disrupted by divine intervention. They suggest that the careful rewrapping and relabeling of these bodies by ancient priests represents emergency procedures conducted in the aftermath of catastrophic plagues. The actual archaeological context tells a different story entirely. The multiple mummies found in Amenhotep II's tomb represent a well-documented phenomenon in Egyptian archaeology known as royal caches. During periods of political instability, particularly in the 21st dynasty, religious authorities systematically moved threatened royal remains to more secure locations. This process is documented in hieratic inscriptions on the mummy wrappings themselves, providing clear evidence that the relocations occurred centuries after the original burials and reflected administrative decisions rather than emergency responses to supernatural events. Professional archaeologists have also addressed claims about a mysterious young royal whose remains supposedly provide evidence for the biblical plague that killed Egypt's firstborn. These theories typically focus on unidentified mummies found in royal caches, with amateur investigators claiming that forensic analysis reveals sudden death consistent with supernatural intervention. Photographs of damaged wrappings or skeletal remains are presented as proof of divine punishment targeting Egyptian royalty. Careful examination by professional conservators and medical experts reveals that the young individuals in question died from causes common in the ancient world, including childhood diseases that claimed many lives regardless of social status. The burial procedures show normal preparation techniques for royal mummies, not the rushed methods that sensational theories claim to detect. Where dating evidence is available, it often places these burials in time periods that have no connection to proposed Exodus chronologies. The persistence of these claims, despite professional debunking, reflects the powerful appeal of discovering physical proof for cherished religious narratives. Online communities dedicated to biblical archaeology share and reshare images that seem to confirm their theories, often without checking the original sources or considering alternative explanations. Comment sections become echo chambers where like-minded individuals reinforce each other's interpretations while dismissing expert analysis as biased or incomplete. Reddit communities focused on archaeology and Egyptology have documented numerous examples of how legitimate archaeological specimens get transformed into sensational evidence through selective presentation and creative interpretation. Professional researchers regularly attempt to provide accurate information about specific claims, but their careful qualifications and technical language struggle to compete with more confident assertions that promise simple answers to complex questions. The Washington Post and other mainstream media outlets have covered some of these archaeological controversies, typically concluding that professional Egyptologists consistently reject the more dramatic claims as unsubstantiated. Academic experts use remarkably consistent language in their evaluations, describing amateur theories as lacking evidentiary support based on misinterpretation of data or reflecting fundamental misunderstandings about archaeological methodology and Egyptian history. This pattern of professional rejection reflects the rigorous standards that govern legitimate archaeological research rather than arbitrary skepticism toward religious interpretations. Claims must be supported by multiple lines of evidence that can be verified by independent researchers. Interpretations must account for alternative explanations and be proportional to the strength of supporting data. Extraordinary assertions require extraordinary proof that meets established scientific criteria for reliability and validity. YouTube channels and documentary productions have played a significant role in popularizing these theories, often presenting amateur research with production values that rival legitimate scientific programming. Dramatic music, authoritative narration, and impressive visual effects create an aura of credibility around claims that would not survive basic peer review in academic journals. The format allows for selective presentation of evidence while avoiding the methodological scrutiny that characterizes professional archaeological publications. Professional organizations have attempted to address these challenges through educational initiatives and media guidelines, but they face fundamental disadvantages in competing for public attention. Legitimate archaeological research moves slowly and cautiously, with conclusions that remain provisional and subject to revision as new evidence emerges. Amateur investigations can make dramatic declarations and promise revolutionary discoveries without the constraints of scholarly methodology or peer review processes. The Archaeological Institute of America has developed specific resources for evaluating archaeological claims found in popular media, emphasizing the importance of peer review, multiple lines of evidence, and appropriate scholarly context. The American Schools of Oriental Research provides expert commentary on discoveries related to biblical archaeology, consistently emphasizing the complexity of interpreting ancient evidence and the dangers of premature or exaggerated conclusions. These professional responses highlight the fundamental differences between legitimate archaeological investigation and the sensational claims that circulate widely in popular culture. Real archaeology involves systematic excavation, careful documentation, rigorous analysis, and conservative interpretation of evidence within appropriate historical and cultural contexts. It produces knowledge that is reliable but often incomplete, fascinating but frequently ambiguous, grounded in evidence but necessarily provisional. The contrast becomes particularly clear when examining how professional archaeologists approach the central question of identifying an Exodus pharaoh. Rather than beginning with predetermined conclusions and searching for supporting evidence, legitimate research starts with systematic investigation of available sources and follows the evidence wherever it leads. This approach has consistently failed to produce clear identification of any specific pharaoh with the events described in biblical Exodus narratives. The absence of such evidence does not necessarily invalidate religious faith or biblical authority, but it does require honest acknowledgement that archaeological science cannot currently provide the kind of definitive proof that many seekers hope to find. Professional archaeologists emphasize the importance of evidence-based conclusions over hypothesis-driven storytelling, not from hostility to religious belief, but from commitment to intellectual integrity and methodological rigor. As we prepare to examine what genuine archaeological investigation has revealed about the tombs and artifacts in question, we must distinguish between the excitement of discovery and the careful work of interpretation. The ancient world holds genuine mysteries and remarkable achievements that need no embellishment from speculative theories or manufactured controversies. The authentic story of ancient Egyptian civilization, revealed through decades of patient research, proves more fascinating and ultimately more satisfying than any simplified narrative that promises easy answers to complex historical questions. The limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings hold their secrets reluctantly, yielding them only to those patient enough to work within the rhythms of desert time. On a sweltering day in February 1898, French archaeologist Victor Leray stood at the entrance to what would become one of the most significant tomb discoveries in Egyptian archaeology. The small opening carved into the cliff face gave no hint of the extraordinary chambers that lay beyond, or of the mysteries that would captivate researchers for more than a century. Loret's team had been working methodically through the valley, following subtle clues in the landscape that suggested hidden burial sites. The ancient Egyptians were masters of concealment when it came to protecting royal tombs, and many pharaohs lay undisturbed beneath tons of rock and debris accumulated over 3 millennia. Cave V35, as this tomb would come to be designated, appeared to be just another sealed entrance among many that dotted the valley walls. What they found as they cleared away centuries of accumulated rubble was a tomb unlike any other yet discovered. The initial chambers were modest by royal standards, their walls decorated with scenes from the Amduat, the ancient Egyptian book that described the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld. These paintings, executed in the characteristic style of the 18th dynasty, glowed with colors that had remained vivid in the dry desert air. The burial chamber itself contained the granite sarcophagus of Amenhotep II, one of Egypt's great warrior pharaohs who had ruled during the empire's golden age some 14 centuries before Christ. His mummy lay undisturbed within the stone coffin, wrapped in linen bandages that had been carefully arranged by ancient embalmers. Around the sarcophagus, the dried remains of funeral bouquets still rested where mourners had placed them over 3,000 years ago, their flowers reduced to fragile fragments that crumbled at a touch. But the true surprise awaited in the tomb's side chambers. Here, Loret's team discovered something unprecedented in Egyptian archaeology: a cache of royal mummies that had been carefully rewrapped and stored by ancient priests during a later period when tomb robbery threatened the security of royal burials throughout the valley. The bodies had been moved from their original resting places and gathered here for safekeeping, creating an extraordinary collection of pharaohs from different dynasties and time periods. The mummy cache represented one of the most important discoveries in the history of Egyptology, comparable to the famous cache found at Deir el-Bahari 2 decades earlier. Among the bodies were some of the most celebrated rulers of ancient Egypt, their remains carefully preserved and labeled by the priests who had undertaken the dangerous work of moving them. Each mummy told its own story through the techniques used in preservation, the materials employed in wrapping, and the condition in which it had survived the centuries. Modern scientific analysis has revealed extraordinary details about these ancient rulers and the processes used to preserve them. X-ray imaging allows researchers to examine the mummies without unwrapping them, revealing bone structures, dental conditions, and evidence of diseases that affected the living pharaohs. CT scans provide three-dimensional images that can show previously hidden details about mummification techniques and the physical characteristics of individual rulers. Amenhotep II himself emerges from these studies as a robust man who lived to be approximately 45 to 50 years old, dying sometime around 1397 BC during what was considered the prime of life for an ancient Egyptian ruler. His mummy shows the characteristics of someone who had been physically active, with strong bone development consistent with his reputation as an accomplished athlete and military commander. The embalmers had done their work with exceptional skill, using the finest materials and techniques available during the height of Egyptian civilization. Chemical analysis of the mummification materials reveals the sophisticated understanding that ancient Egyptian embalmers possessed about preservation techniques. The resins, oils, and salts used in the process were carefully selected and applied according to methods that had been refined over centuries of practice. Far from being hasty or improvised, the mummification of Amenhotep II shows every sign of careful planning and execution by master craftsmen who took pride in their work. The tomb's construction also reflects normal Egyptian burial practices rather than emergency procedures. The chambers were carved according to standard patterns used for royal tombs of the period, with proper attention to religious requirements and architectural traditions. The wall decorations follow conventional themes and artistic styles, showing no signs of haste or deviation from established norms. Even the placement of the burial goods reflects careful consideration of religious beliefs about the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. Archaeological context provides crucial information that is often missing from sensationalized accounts of the tomb's contents. The burial chamber contained the usual array of objects considered necessary for the pharaoh's journey through the underworld: canopic jars to hold preserved internal organs, shabtis figures to serve as workers in the afterlife, jewelry and amulets for protection, and weapons for defense against the dangers that awaited in the realm of the dead. None of these objects shows any deviation from standard burial practices of the period. The materials are those commonly used for royal burials: gold, silver, precious stones, and fine wood imported from distant lands. The craftsmanship reflects the high skill levels of Egyptian artisans working under normal conditions rather than crisis circumstances. The religious symbolism follows established patterns that had been refined over centuries of royal burial practices. The presence of multiple mummies in the tomb's side chambers reflects historical circumstances that are well documented in Egyptian records rather than supernatural intervention. During the 21st dynasty, approximately 4 centuries after Amenhotep II's death, political instability and increased tomb robbery made it necessary for religious authorities to take extraordinary measures to protect royal remains. Teams of priests, working under dangerous conditions and at great personal risk, systematically opened threatened tombs and moved their contents to more secure locations. This process of reburial, known to scholars as the royal cache phenomenon, was documented by the ancient priests themselves in hieratic inscriptions written on the mummy wrappings and accompanying papyri. These texts provide detailed information about when the moves occurred, who authorized them, and why they were considered necessary. The priests viewed their work as a sacred duty to preserve the bodies of divine kings for their journey through eternity. The meticulous records kept by these ancient preservationists allow modern archaeologists to trace the complex history of individual mummies through multiple relocations over several centuries. Some bodies were moved more than once as political conditions changed and new threats emerged. Others were rewrapped and relabeled when their original identifications became unclear or when damage from tomb robbers made their previous arrangements unsuitable. Carbon dating of organic materials from the tomb provides scientific confirmation of the timeline established through historical analysis. Wood samples from coffins and furniture yield dates consistent with the reign of Amenhotep II and the later reburial activities of the 21st dynasty priests. Textile samples from mummy wrappings show similar chronological patterns, with some materials dating to the original burial period and others reflecting the later conservation efforts. Microscopic analysis of the mummy wrappings reveals details about ancient Egyptian textile production and the materials available to royal embalmers. The linen used for the highest quality wrappings was woven from flax grown in carefully tended fields along the Nile, processed according to techniques that produced cloth of remarkable fineness and durability. Different grades of linen were used for different purposes in the mummification process, with the finest reserved for the outermost layers that would be visible to those who viewed the completed mummy. The preservation conditions within KV35 have provided researchers with an exceptional opportunity to study ancient Egyptian burial practices in detail. The tomb's sealed environment, protected from humidity and temperature fluctuations by tons of limestone, created ideal conditions for organic preservation. Materials that would have decayed quickly in other environments survived here in remarkable condition, providing insights into ancient technologies and religious practices that would otherwise have been lost forever. Professional conservators working with the mummies have developed sophisticated techniques for studying and preserving these irreplaceable specimens. Each investigation requires careful planning to minimize any risk to the ancient remains while maximizing the scientific information that can be extracted. Non-invasive imaging techniques allow detailed examination without physical disturbance. When samples are required for chemical analysis, they are taken in microscopic quantities using sterile procedures developed specifically for archaeological materials. The results of these investigations paint a picture of normal Egyptian burial practices carried out according to established religious and cultural traditions. The embalmers who prepared Amenhotep II and the priests who later moved his mummy were following procedures that had been refined over centuries of practice. Their work reflects the deep respect that Egyptian civilization held for deceased rulers and the elaborate beliefs about the afterlife that motivated such careful preservation efforts. Sensational interpretations of the tomb's contents often ignore this careful archaeological context in favor of dramatic narratives that support predetermined conclusions. When evidence is viewed outside its proper historical and cultural framework, normal practices can be made to appear mysterious or supernatural. Routine burial procedures become emergency measures. Standard preservation techniques are reimagined as evidence of hasty preparation under crisis conditions. The importance of archaeological caution becomes clear when examining how premature or exaggerated claims can distort public understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. The tomb of Amenhotep II represents one of the finest examples of royal burial practices from one of Egypt's most prosperous periods. Its contents provide invaluable insights into ancient religious beliefs, artistic achievements, and technical capabilities. These genuine discoveries are remarkable enough without the addition of speculative elements that lack evidentiary support. As we prepare to examine the historical context that might link Amenhotep II to biblical narratives, we carry with us this foundation of archaeological fact rather than sensational speculation. The pharaoh's actual reign, documented through inscriptions and artifacts rather than wishful interpretation, provides a fascinating window into the complex world of ancient Egyptian imperial power and its interactions with the peoples of the ancient Near East. The hot desert wind carried the dust of countless footsteps across the ancient battlefields of the Levant as Amenhotep II returned from his campaigns in triumph. Behind his golden chariot stretched a procession that would have dazzled observers with its display of imperial power and human misery intertwined. Captured princes walked in chains alongside their former soldiers. Craftsmen who had once worked in freedom now faced a lifetime of servitude in Egyptian workshops. Children torn from their families marched toward an uncertain future in the land of the pharaohs. The royal scribes who recorded these victories wrote with obvious pride about the scale of their king's conquests. Their hieroglyphic accounts, carved into temple walls that still stand today, speak of prisoners taken by the thousands from cities across what the Egyptians called the land of Retjenu, the ancient territories that would later be known as Syria and Palestine. The numbers they recorded seem almost impossible to modern minds. Over 100,000 captives from a single campaign, entire populations transplanted from their ancestral homes to serve the growing needs of Egyptian civilization. These campaigns of Amenhotep II, conducted during the middle of the 14th century before Christ, represent one of the most dramatic examples of ancient imperial expansion and its human costs. The pharaoh, barely into his 20s when he began his military career, showed a ruthless efficiency in extending Egyptian control over the trade routes and tribute-bearing cities of the eastern Mediterranean. His armies swept through fortified settlements with the disciplined precision that had made Egypt the dominant power of its age. The inscriptions describing these conquests provide fascinating glimpses into the mechanics of ancient warfare and its aftermath. We read of siege techniques that allowed Egyptian forces to overcome even the strongest defensive positions. We learn about the systematic organization of captured populations with skilled workers separated from common laborers and royal families isolated from their subjects. We see the careful accounting that tracked human beings as precisely as gold or grain, reducing individual lives to entries in administrative records. Among the most detailed of these accounts comes from the Great Temple at Karnak, where Amenhotep II commissioned artists to create vivid scenes of his military triumphs. The reliefs show bound captives from various ethnic groups, their distinctive clothing and physical features carefully rendered to demonstrate the pharaoh's power over diverse peoples. Accompanying hieroglyphic texts list specific numbers of prisoners taken from particular cities, creating a grim catalogue of human displacement on a massive scale. The ethnic diversity of these captives is particularly striking when viewed through the lens of biblical narratives. The Egyptian texts speak of Asiatics, a term they used to describe peoples from the eastern lands that included what would later become the territories of the 12 tribes of Israel. Among the prisoners are Shasu Bedouins, Canaanites from fortified cities, and what the inscriptions call Apiru, a term that some scholars have tentatively connected to the Hebrew people mentioned in biblical texts. But perhaps the most haunting connection between these ancient Egyptian records and biblical imagery comes not from the military campaigns themselves, but from the domestic scenes that decorated the tombs of Egyptian officials during this same period. In the burial chamber of Rekhmir, who served as vizier under Amenhotep II, Artists created detailed paintings that show foreign workers engaged in various forms of labor for their Egyptian masters. Among these scenes is one that has captured the attention of biblical scholars and archaeologists for generations. It shows a group of Semitic workers, identifiable by their distinctive beards and colorful garments, engaged in the process of making bricks from mud and straw. The workers strain under heavy loads while Egyptian overseers watch with rods in their hands, ready to ensure that productivity remains high. The visual parallel to the biblical description of Hebrew slavery in Egypt is so striking that reproductions of this painting appear in countless books and documentaries about Exodus narratives. The brick-making scene in Rekhmire's tomb provides a tangible link between archaeological evidence and biblical imagery that goes beyond mere coincidence. The process shown in the painting matches exactly the description given in the Book of Exodus, where Hebrew slaves are forced to make bricks for Pharaoh's construction projects. The presence of straw in the brick-making process, specifically mentioned in biblical accounts, appears clearly in the Egyptian artwork. Even the postures of the workers and the positioning of the overseers seem to echo the oppressive relationship described in Scripture. Yet the interpretation of such scenes requires careful consideration of their broader historical context. The tomb paintings were created to celebrate the achievements of Egyptian officials and to demonstrate their contribution to the empire's prosperity. Foreign workers represented valuable resources that enhanced Egypt's economic and military power. The scenes were intended to impress viewers with the extent of Egyptian dominance rather than to record specific historical events or individual ethnic groups. The systematic enslavement of captured populations was standard practice for all major ancient empires, not a unique policy directed against any particular people. Assyrians, Babylonians, Hittites, and other imperial powers regularly transplanted conquered populations to prevent rebellion and to provide labor for major construction projects. The Egyptian approach differed primarily in its scale and organization rather than in its fundamental concept of treating human beings as transferable resources. Archaeological evidence from Egyptian construction sites of this period confirms the widespread use of foreign labor in major building projects. Excavations at sites like Pi Rames and Tanis have uncovered workers' villages with clear evidence of ethnic diversity among the inhabitants. Pottery styles reflect influences from various regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. Burial practices show mixtures of Egyptian and foreign traditions. Personal names recorded on ostraca, limestone flakes used for everyday writing, include examples from multiple linguistic traditions. The working conditions revealed by these excavations paint a complex picture that defies simple characterization as either benevolent employment or brutal oppression. Workers received regular food rations that included bread, beer, and vegetables in quantities that suggest adequate nutrition by ancient standards. Housing arrangements varied considerably, with some workers living in family groups while others were housed in more institutional settings. Evidence of medical care appears in the form of treated injuries and surgical procedures performed on workers who suffered accidents during construction projects. Yet, the fundamental reality of unfreedom permeates all these arrangements. Workers could not leave their assigned projects. Families could be separated according to administrative convenience. Punishment for infractions could be severe, as demonstrated by legal documents that record penalties ranging from additional labor requirements to physical punishment. The paternalistic care provided by Egyptian administrators should not obscure the coercive nature of the relationship between captors and captives. The scale of labor organization required for major Egyptian construction projects staggers the modern imagination. Building a single pyramid required coordinating the efforts of thousands of workers over periods of decades. Constructing the massive temples that dominated Egyptian cities involved quarrying stone in distant locations, transporting blocks weighing many tons, and lifting them into position with primitive tools and human muscle power. Only a sophisticated administrative system backed by imperial military power could marshal the human resources necessary for such undertakings. Written records from Egyptian archives provide detailed insights into how these massive labor forces were organized and controlled. Work gangs were assigned specific tasks and given names that reflected their functions or origins. Ration lists tracked food distribution with accounting precision that would satisfy modern bureaucrats. Medical records documented injuries and treatments, Disciplinary reports noted infractions and punishments. The sheer volume of documentation reveals an administrative apparatus devoted to managing human beings as carefully as any other valuable resource. The religious dimensions of this forced labor system add another layer of complexity to its historical significance. Egyptian ideology portrayed the pharaoh as a divine ruler whose construction projects served religious purposes that transcended mere political power. Temples honored gods whose favor protected the entire kingdom. Pyramids and royal tombs facilitated the pharaoh's transition to divine status after death. Royal palaces provided settings for ceremonies that maintained cosmic order. From this perspective, foreign workers participated in sacred activities that benefited not only Egypt but the entire civilized world. This religious justification for imperial expansion and forced labor was not unique to Egypt but appeared in various forms throughout the ancient world. Babylonian kings claimed divine authorization for their conquests. Assyrian inscriptions portrayed military campaigns as holy wars blessed by national gods. Even smaller kingdoms developed ideologies that justified the subordination of foreign peoples as part of divinely ordained hierarchies. The Egyptian version was distinctive primarily in its sophistication and longevity rather than in its basic assumptions about imperial rights and divine sanction. The intersection of these documented Egyptian practices with biblical narratives creates a fascinating area of historical investigation that requires careful navigation between evidence and speculation. The Egyptian records clearly document the systematic enslavement of peoples from the regions later associated with Israelite settlement. The archaeological evidence confirms the use of foreign labor in Egyptian construction projects. The artistic representations show working conditions and ethnic relationships that parallel biblical descriptions. Yet the leap from these general parallels to specific historical connections requires evidence that remains elusive. No Egyptian text specifically mentions the Hebrew people as described in biblical sources. No archaeological site has yielded clear evidence of the particular events described in Exodus narratives. No inscription records the sudden departure of a large slave population that would have severely disrupted Egyptian economic and military capabilities. This absence of direct confirmation does not invalidate the historical significance of the parallels that do exist. The Egyptian evidence provides a plausible historical context within which events similar to those described in biblical sources might have occurred. The systematic nature of Egyptian imperial expansion and population transfer suggests that the experiences attributed to Hebrew ancestors were shared by many other groups during this period of intense imperial competition in the ancient Near East. As we turn to examine the earliest clear mention of Israel in Egyptian records, we carry with us this understanding of the broader imperial context within which such mentions might have significance. The world of Amenhotep II was one of massive population movements, systematic exploitation of human resources, and complex interactions between imperial powers and subject peoples that left traces in both archaeological evidence and collective memory. In the winter of 1896, British archaeologist Flinders Petrie made a discovery that would forever change our understanding of ancient Israel's place in the historical record. Working in the ruins of Merneptah's mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, Petrie's team uncovered a massive granite stele that had been used as building material in a later construction project. The stone monument, standing over 7 feet tall and covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions, had been carved during the 5th year of Merneptah's reign, sometime around 1208 BC. At first glance, the stele appeared to be another example of the royal victory inscriptions that Egyptian pharaohs routinely commissioned to celebrate their military achievements. The hieroglyphic text, written in the classical style of the 19th dynasty, proclaimed Merneptah's triumphs over various enemies who had dared to challenge Egyptian power. Libya had been devastated, the inscription declared. Hatti had been pacified. Canaan had been plundered. The formulaic language was familiar to scholars who had studied dozens of similar monuments from Egyptian temples and tombs, but buried within this conventional listing of conquered territories was a single line that would spark decades of scholarly debate and reshape understanding of biblical chronology. Among the defeated peoples mentioned in the victory hymn appeared a name that Petrie's team initially struggled to decipher: Israel. The hieroglyphic determinative accompanying the name indicated that this was not a city or territory, but a people, marking the first known reference to Israel in any ancient text outside biblical sources. The implications of this discovery rippled through the academic world with extraordinary force. For the first time, archaeology had provided independent confirmation that a people called Israel existed in the ancient world during a specific historical period. The Merneptah Stele, as it came to be known, represented tangible proof that biblical narratives contained at least some elements rooted in historical reality. The stone itself became known as the Israel Stele, cementing its significance in the intersection between archaeology and religious studies. The text of the relevant passage, when translated from hieroglyphic script, reads with the stark simplicity of military reportage, "Israel is laid waste and his seed is not." The brutal efficiency of this declaration reflects the standard rhetoric of ancient warfare, where complete annihilation of enemy populations represented the ultimate military achievement. Yet the very mention of Israel in this context suggests that by 1208 BC, the people bearing this name had become significant enough to warrant inclusion in a pharaoh's victory proclamation. The historical context surrounding the Merneptah Stele provides crucial insights into the conditions that might have produced such a reference. Merneptah ruled Egypt during a period of significant upheaval in the eastern Mediterranean, when the collapse of the Hittite Empire had created power vacuums throughout the region. The Sea Peoples, mysterious maritime raiders whose origins remain disputed, were launching devastating attacks on coastal cities from Anatolia to the Nile Delta. Traditional trade networks were disrupting, and established political relationships were breaking down under the pressure of migration and warfare. In this chaotic environment, Egyptian military forces were conducting campaigns designed to reassert pharaonic control over tribute-bearing territories that had grown restive during the instability. The Canaan region, which had been under Egyptian influence for centuries, required periodic military intervention to maintain order and ensure continued loyalty. Local populations, whether recently settled or long established, represented potential threats to Egyptian interests that needed to be addressed through diplomatic pressure or military action. The reference to Israel in this context suggests that by the late 13th century BC, a people bearing this name had established themselves in the Canaan region with sufficient organization and military capability to attract Egyptian attention. The use of the people determinative rather than the city or territory determinative indicates that the Egyptians viewed Israel as a tribal or ethnic group rather than as a settled urban population. This distinction has important implications for understanding the social and political development of early Israelite communities. Archaeological evidence from the Canaan highlands during this period reveals a pattern of new settlement activity that may relate to the emergence of early Israelite communities. Hundreds of small villages appeared in previously sparsely populated hill country during the 13th and 12th centuries BC. These settlements show distinctive characteristics that set them apart from contemporary Canaanite urban centers: simpler architecture, absence of imported luxury goods, and subsistence strategies focused on agriculture and pastoralism rather than long-distance trade. The material culture of these highland villages suggests communities that were either ethnically distinct from their Canaanite neighbors or deliberately choosing lifestyles that emphasized self-sufficiency over participation in broader economic networks. The absence of pig bones from food refuse, noted at numerous sites, may indicate dietary practices that anticipated later Jewish religious law. The prevalence of four-room houses, a distinctive architectural style, suggests shared building traditions that spread across the highland region during this period. Yet the connection between these archaeological patterns and the Israel mentioned in the Merneptah Stele remains necessarily speculative. Archaeological evidence can demonstrate when and where people lived, what they ate, and how they built their houses, but it cannot directly reveal the names by which these people called themselves or were known to their neighbors. The leap from material remains to ethnic identification requires external evidence of the kind provided by the Merneptah Stele, but even such evidence leaves many questions unanswered. The timing of the Merneptah Stele's reference to Israel has profound implications for dating the biblical Exodus narrative, though these implications remain subject to scholarly debate. If a people called Israel were already established in Canaan by 1208 BC, then any exodus from Egypt must have occurred earlier than this date. Traditional biblical chronologies, which place the Exodus around 1440 BC based on internal scriptural evidence, would be consistent with this archaeological timeline. Alternative dating schemes that propose a 13th century Exodus face more complex chronological challenges. The question becomes further complicated when we consider the broader pattern of evidence for Israelite presence in the archaeological record. The highland settlements that may represent early Israelite communities show continuity of occupation through the 12th and 11th centuries BC, suggesting a gradual process of population growth and territorial consolidation rather than sudden arrival from elsewhere. This pattern seems more consistent with indigenous development or gradual infiltration than with the dramatic mass migration described in biblical conquest narratives. Some scholars have suggested that the Israel mentioned by Merneptah may represent only a portion of the population groups that would later be identified with biblical Israel. Ancient ethnic identities were often fluid and contextual, with the same populations calling themselves by different names in different circumstances or being known by different names to various neighbors. The Egypt-based group whose exodus is described in biblical sources might have joined with indigenous Canaan populations to form the Israel that appears in later historical records. This possibility finds support in biblical texts themselves, which describe the incorporation of various non-Israelite groups into the emerging Hebrew Confederation. The mixed multitude that supposedly accompanied the Israelites out of Egypt, the Gibeonites who negotiated a treaty with Joshua's forces, and the various Canaanite populations who were said to be absorbed rather than displaced all suggest that early Israelite identity was more complex and inclusive than simple ethnic or genealogical categories might suggest. The linguistic evidence surrounding the name Israel itself adds another layer of complexity to these historical questions. The Hebrew etymology of the name, traditionally interpreted as meaning one who wrestles with God, reflects theological rather than historical concerns. Alternative etymologies suggest possible connections to other ancient Near Eastern divine names or tribal designations. The fact that the name appears in Egyptian hieroglyphic script demonstrates that it had achieved sufficient recognition to be incorporated into Egyptian administrative and military terminology. The survival of the Merneptah stele through more than 3 millennia of political upheaval and environmental change represents a remarkable convergence of historical circumstances. The granite monument was strong enough to withstand centuries of weathering while remaining legible to modern scholars equipped with knowledge of hieroglyphic writing. Its reuse as building material in later construction projects provided unintentional protection from deliberate destruction by conquerors who might have targeted it for ideological reasons. Modern scientific analysis of the stele has confirmed both its authenticity and its approximate date, eliminating concerns about potential forgery that have affected other claimed biblical artifacts. The granite itself has been traced to quarries in the Aswan region of southern Egypt, confirming that it was created using materials and techniques consistent with other 19th dynasty monuments. The hieroglyphic script shows characteristics typical of royal inscriptions from Merneptah's reign, and the historical references contained in the text align with other evidence for political conditions during the late 13th century BC. The broader significance of the Merneptah stele extends beyond its specific reference to Israel to illuminate the complex relationships between textual and archaeological evidence in reconstructing ancient history. The monument demonstrates that significant historical events and populations can leave traces in multiple types of evidence that complement and complicate each other. It also illustrates the importance of maintaining appropriate scholarly caution when interpreting isolated pieces of evidence within broader historical narratives. The stele's declaration that Israel is laid waste and his seed is not obviously proved premature, given the subsequent historical development of Israelite kingdoms and Jewish civilization. This false prediction serves as a reminder that ancient royal inscriptions often reflected political propaganda and wishful thinking as much as accurate military reporting. Egyptian pharaohs regularly claimed complete victories over enemies who continued to pose threats in subsequent campaigns. The survival and eventual prominence of Israel in later historical periods suggests that Merneptah's military achievements in Canaan were less decisive than his victory inscription claimed. As we prepare to examine why archaeological evidence for the Exodus remains elusive despite these tantalizing connections, we must remember that the Merneptah stele raises as many questions as it answers. It confirms that people called Israel existed in the ancient world during a specific time period, but it tells us little about their origins, their relationship to biblical narratives, or their connection to the highland settlements that archaeologists have identified with early Israelite communities. The stone speaks with the authentic voice of ancient history, but like most ancient voices, it speaks in fragments and riddles that require careful interpretation within broader patterns of evidence and analysis. In universities and research institutions around the world, professional archaeologists who specialize in ancient Egyptian civilization face a peculiar challenge. Their carefully conducted research, published in peer-reviewed journals and presented at academic conferences, competes for public attention with sensational claims that promise simple answers to complex historical questions. The methodical processes that distinguish reliable scholarship from appealing speculation often struggle to match the dramatic certainty of amateur investigations that circulate widely on social media platforms. The contrast becomes clear when examining how professional Egyptologists approach the question of identifying an Exodus pharaoh. Legitimate archaeological research begins with systematic excavation of sites, careful documentation of artifacts in their original contexts, and rigorous analysis using established scientific methods. Conclusions emerge gradually through the accumulation of evidence from multiple sources, tested against alternative explanations and subjected to review by other experts in relevant fields. Amateur investigators, by contrast, often begin with predetermined conclusions and then search for evidence that appears to support their theories. They may focus on isolated artifacts or inscriptions while ignoring broader patterns of evidence that complicate their interpretations. They frequently lack the linguistic training necessary to read ancient texts accurately or the archaeological experience needed to understand how artifacts relate to their historical contexts. Professional archaeologists have consistently clarified that no credible tomb or inscription definitively names an Exodus pharaoh, despite decades of intensive research in Egyptian sites and archives. This consensus reflects not institutional bias or religious hostility, but the simple absence of clear evidence for the specific events described in biblical narratives. The documentary record of New Kingdom Egypt, preserved in thousands of papyrus texts and inscribed monuments, contains no administrative records of sudden slave departures, no military dispatches describing army losses in the Red Sea, no medical texts chronicling devastating plagues. The Archaeological Institute of America, the premier professional organization for archaeologists in North America, has developed guidelines for evaluating archaeological claims found in popular media. These guidelines emphasize the importance of peer review, multiple lines of evidence, and appropriate scholarly context. Claims that cannot meet these standards, regardless of their emotional appeal or theological significance, do not qualify as legitimate contributions to historical understanding. Similar standards govern the work of professional Egyptologists worldwide. The International Association of Egyptologists maintains strict criteria for evaluating discoveries and interpretations related to ancient Egyptian civilization. Research must be published in peer-reviewed journals where other experts can examine methodologies and challenge conclusions. Claims must be supported by multiple types of evidence and tested against alternative explanations. Extraordinary assertions require extraordinary proof that can be verified by independent researchers. These professional standards create an inherent tension with popular expectations shaped by media representations of archaeological discovery. Television documentaries and internet videos often present dramatic revelations and definitive identifications that would never survive academic peer review. Productions like Expedition Bible employ impressive visual effects and authoritative narration to create an aura of credibility around claims that lack adequate evidentiary support. The manipulation of evidence in such productions typically involves subtle distortions that require specialist knowledge to detect. Photographs may be enhanced to emphasize features that support particular interpretations. chronological data may be presented with greater precision than the evidence actually warrants. Alternative explanations may be dismissed without adequate consideration. The cumulative effect creates a false impression of scientific rigor while avoiding the actual methodological standards that govern legitimate archaeological research. Professional organizations have documented numerous examples of how legitimate archaeological discoveries get transformed into sensational claims through this process. The tomb of Amenhotep II, for instance, represents a genuine archaeological treasure that provides valuable insights into Egyptian burial practices and political history. But in the hands of amateur investigators, its contents become evidence for biblical plagues, supernatural interventions, and covered-up discoveries that supposedly threaten established religious and academic institutions. The American Schools of Oriental Research, which has coordinated archaeological research in the Middle East for over a century, regularly addresses misconceptions about biblical archaeology that circulate in popular media. Their publications and conferences emphasize the complexity of interpreting ancient evidence and the importance of maintaining appropriate scholarly caution when drawing connections between archaeological discoveries and biblical narratives. This emphasis on scholarly caution reflects hard-won lessons about the dangers of premature or exaggerated claims in archaeological interpretation. The history of Near Eastern archaeology includes numerous examples of initially exciting discoveries that proved far less significant when subjected to rigorous analysis. Artifacts that seemed to confirm biblical accounts turned out to have more mundane explanations. Inscriptions that appeared to mention biblical figures proved to refer to different individuals or events. Sites that were identified with biblical locations proved to date to wrong time periods or represent different cultural traditions. These experiences have taught professional archaeologists to maintain healthy skepticism about dramatic claims and to insist on multiple lines of converging evidence before drawing firm conclusions about ancient events or identifications. This methodological conservatism may seem frustrating to those seeking definitive answers, but it serves the crucial function of distinguishing reliable knowledge from wishful thinking. The challenge facing professional archaeology extends beyond simply correcting misinformation to addressing fundamental misunderstandings about how archaeological knowledge develops. Popular media often presents archaeological discovery as a process of sudden revelation where a single artifact or inscription provides definitive proof for historical theories. The reality involves gradual accumulation of evidence over decades of research, with conclusions that remain provisional and subject to revision as new information emerges. Archaeological dating provides a clear example of this complexity. Methods like radiocarbon analysis and ceramic typology can provide approximate dates for ancient materials, but these dates come with margins of error that may span several centuries. When amateur investigators claim to have identified specific pharaohs or precise chronological connections based on such evidence, they are typically exceeding what the data can actually support. Similar limitations affect efforts to connect archaeological evidence with specific historical events or individuals mentioned in biblical texts. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions rarely provide the kind of detailed narrative information needed to establish clear connections with biblical accounts. Royal names and regnal dates can be established with reasonable confidence, but the specific actions and experiences attributed to individual pharaohs often remain unclear or subject to competing interpretations. The absence of clear Egyptian evidence for Exodus events does not necessarily invalidate biblical narratives, but it does require careful consideration of alternative explanations for how these stories developed and were preserved. Professional biblical scholars, working in collaboration with archaeologists and historians, have developed sophisticated theories about the relationship between historical events and religious literature that acknowledge both the authentic historical memories embedded in biblical texts and their theological and literary functions. These scholarly approaches recognize that ancient religious literature served purposes beyond simple historical recording. Biblical narratives were shaped by theological concerns, literary conventions, and the needs of particular communities at specific times in their development. Understanding these texts requires attention to their original contexts and functions, rather than simply treating them as straightforward historical accounts that can be confirmed or refuted through archaeological evidence. The polarization between professional archaeological expertise and popular amateur theories reflects broader cultural tensions about the authority of specialized knowledge in democratic societies. When archaeological conclusions conflict with cherished religious beliefs or cultural assumptions, some communities may reject professional expertise in favor of alternative authorities who provide more satisfying answers. This dynamic creates challenges for science education and public understanding that extend far beyond archaeology to affect fields like climate science, medical research, and evolutionary biology. The solution requires not just better communication of scientific findings, but also cultivation of critical thinking skills that enable citizens to evaluate competing claims about complex subjects. Museums and educational institutions have developed programs designed to help visitors understand how archaeological knowledge develops and why professional standards matter for distinguishing reliable information from speculation. These programs emphasize hands-on experience with archaeological methods and direct engagement with primary evidence rather than simply presenting conclusions derived from expert research. The Smithsonian Institution, the British Museum, and other major cultural institutions have created educational resources that explain how professional archaeologists evaluate evidence and reach conclusions about ancient civilizations. These resources emphasize the exciting aspects of genuine archaeological discovery while helping audiences understand why methodological rigor is essential for producing reliable knowledge about the past. Digital technologies offer new opportunities for sharing archaeological research with broader audiences while maintaining appropriate scholarly standards. Online databases allow public access to excavation records, artifact catalogs, and research publications that were previously available only to specialists. Virtual museum tours and three-dimensional modeling enable detailed examination of archaeological sites and objects without the distortions introduced by selective photography or creative editing. Yet technology alone cannot solve the fundamental challenge of helping people distinguish between reliable knowledge and appealing speculation in an information environment where both compete for attention with equal apparent authority. The future of public understanding may depend as much on developing better strategies for science communication as on making new archaeological discoveries. The morning sun cast long shadows across the limestone cliffs west of Luxor as Dr. Piers Litherland stood at the entrance to a tomb that had remained sealed for over 3 millennia. The discovery, announced by Egyptian authorities in February 2025, represented the first royal burial found in the area since Howard Carter uncovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. But this was not the tomb of the boy pharaoh whose golden mask had captivated the world. This was something equally remarkable: the original burial place of Thutmose II, a pharaoh whose tomb had been the last missing piece in the archaeological puzzle of Egypt's 18th dynasty rulers. The tomb, designated C4 by the excavation team, had been hidden in Wadi Gabanat El Khurud, approximately 2.4 kilometers west of the famous Valley of the Kings. Ground-penetrating surveys had detected anomalies in the area, but it took years of careful investigation to locate the tomb's entrance beneath centuries of accumulated debris from flash floods that periodically swept through the desert valley. The discovery demonstrated how much of Egypt's archaeological heritage still lies buried beneath seemingly barren landscapes, waiting for improved technology and methodical investigation to reveal its secrets. Dr. Litherland, an honorary research associate at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at Cambridge University, had been working in the region as part of the New Kingdom Research Foundation's ongoing investigations into royal burial practices of the early 18th dynasty. When his team first discovered the tomb's entrance and main corridor in October 2022, they initially believed it might belong to one of the royal wives, given its proximity to known burial sites of Thutmose III's wives and its location near where Queen Hatshepsut had originally planned her own tomb. The tomb's architectural features, however, suggested something more significant than a royal wife's burial. The entrance staircase was unusually wide, and the descending corridor showed the kind of substantial construction typically associated with pharaonic tombs. More telling were the decorative elements that survived despite centuries of flood damage. Fragments of blue-painted plaster with yellow stars, representing the night sky that appeared only in royal burial chambers, and portions of hieroglyphic texts from the Amduat, the sacred book that guided deceased pharaohs through their journey in the underworld. The definitive identification came through fragments of alabaster vessels found scattered throughout the tomb's chambers. These duck-shaped containers, used to hold cosmetics and oils for the afterlife, bore hieroglyphic inscriptions that clearly named Thutmose II as the deceased king. Additional inscriptions mentioned Queen Hatshepsut, identifying her role in overseeing her husband's burial arrangements. According to Dr. Mohammed Ismail Khaled, Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, these artifacts represented the first funerary objects ever found that could be definitively linked to Thutmose II. The discovery took on additional significance because of what it revealed about ancient Egyptian responses to natural disasters. Archaeological evidence indicated that the tomb had been severely damaged by flooding approximately 6 years after Thutmose II's burial in 1479 BC. Ancient priests, recognizing that the tomb's contents were at risk, had carefully removed the pharaoh's mummy and burial goods to protect them from further damage. This explained why Thutmose II's mummy had been found in the 19th century at the Deir el-Bahari cache, along with other royal remains that had been relocated during similar preservation efforts. The tomb's simple architectural design provided new insights into the evolution of royal burial practices during the early 18th dynasty. Dr. Litherland noted that the layout featured a plastered corridor leading to a burial chamber positioned 1.4 meters higher than the corridor floor, a design that would influence later royal tombs, including that of Tutankhamun. This elevated chamber arrangement had practical advantages, allowing easier removal of burial goods when circumstances required relocation of the tomb's contents. Scientific analysis of materials recovered from the tomb employed the most advanced techniques available to modern archaeology. Three-dimensional scanning created precise digital records of the tomb's architecture and decoration. Chemical analysis of organic materials provided radiocarbon dates that confirmed the burial's placement within established Egyptian chronologies. Microscopic examination of textile fragments revealed details about ancient Egyptian textile production and the quality of materials used in royal mummification. The condition of the tomb itself told a story of both human planning and natural forces that shaped ancient Egyptian burial practices. Flash floods, which continue to affect the area today, had deposited layers of debris throughout the chambers, while also preserving organic materials in ways that would not have occurred in drier environments. The ancient Egyptians' decision to move threatened royal remains to more secure locations reflected their sophisticated understanding of environmental risks and their commitment to preserving divine kingship for eternity. Professor Mohammed Abdel Badi, head of the Egyptian Antiquities sector and co-leader of the excavation mission, emphasized that the discovery provided crucial missing information about the early 18th dynasty, a period when Egypt was establishing the imperial power that would dominate the ancient Near East for centuries. Thutmose II, though he reigned for only 14 years, had been part of the royal family that transformed Egypt from a regional kingdom into an international superpower. The tomb's location in the Western Wadis also suggested new possibilities for future archaeological investigation. Dr. Litherland noted that the area might contain the original burial sites of other early 18th dynasty pharaohs, including Thutmose I and Amenhotep I, whose tombs have never been conclusively identified. The discovery demonstrated that royal burial practices were more varied and geographically dispersed than previously understood, with pharaohs choosing burial locations based on factors that are still being investigated by researchers. Modern digital documentation techniques have revolutionized how such discoveries are recorded and shared with both scholarly and public audiences. High-resolution photography captured details of wall decorations and artifact fragments that would have been impossible to document using earlier methods. Virtual reality modeling allowed researchers around the world to examine the tomb's interior without risking damage to fragile ancient surfaces. Online databases made excavation records immediately available to international scholars who could contribute expertise to ongoing interpretation efforts. The discovery also highlighted the continuing importance of international collaboration in Egyptian archaeology. The joint Egyptian-British team brought together specialists in ancient Egyptian language, art history, conservation science, and digital archaeology. Dr. Judith Bunbury from Cambridge University provided geological expertise about the ancient environment. Dr. Andreas Dorn contributed knowledge of Egyptian funerary texts. Local Egyptian archaeologists, including Mohsen Kamel and Rabbi Isa, provided essential field experience and cultural context. Yet the most intriguing aspect of the discovery may be what Dr. Litherland believes still lies hidden in the area. The team has identified a massive mound of rubble approximately 23 meters high that sits above a point in the landscape where they suspect a second tomb may be concealed. If this second burial site exists and remains intact, it could contain the treasures and burial goods that were removed from the original tomb after the ancient flooding. Dr. Litherland has described the possibility as potentially one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Egyptian history. The careful scientific approach taken by the excavation team contrasts sharply with the sensational claims that regularly circulate in popular media about Egyptian archaeological discoveries. Rather than making dramatic pronouncements about revolutionary findings, the researchers published their initial results in peer-reviewed academic journals where other experts could examine their evidence and methodology. Their conclusions remained appropriately qualified, acknowledging uncertainties while presenting what could be reliably determined from available evidence. The tomb of Thutmose II, while not directly related to biblical Exodus narratives, provides important context for understanding the historical period when such events might have occurred. The 18th dynasty pharaohs ruled Egypt during the Late Bronze Age, when imperial expansion brought Egyptian armies into regular contact with the peoples of Canaan and Syria. The systematic documentation of military campaigns and population transfers during this period creates the historical backdrop against which biblical narratives of Egyptian bondage and liberation might be understood. Carbon dating of organic materials from the tomb has provided precise chronological anchors that help refine understanding of Egyptian imperial expansion and its impact on neighboring populations. The dates confirm that Thutmose II ruled during the early 15th century BC, a period when Egyptian military activities in the Levant were creating the conditions of imperial domination and cultural interaction that appear in various forms throughout ancient Near Eastern literature. Satellite imagery continues to reveal new potential archaeological sites across Egypt's vast desert landscape. Advanced sensors can detect buried structures, ancient road networks, and settlement patterns that guide archaeological investigation toward the most promising locations. The European Space Agency's Sentinel program and NASA's Earth observation satellites provide researchers with unprecedented access to high-resolution imagery that can identify subtle variations in surface features indicating human activity from thousands of years ago. These technological advances have democratized certain aspects of archaeological investigation, allowing researchers with limited fieldwork budgets to conduct preliminary surveys and identify priority areas for excavation. Digital modeling and analysis tools that were once available only to major institutions can now be used by smaller research teams, enabling more diverse participation in archaeological research and discovery. The continuing discovery of royal tombs and burial sites demonstrates that Egypt's archaeological heritage is far from exhausted. Each new find contributes to the growing understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization while raising new questions that require further investigation. The tomb of Thutmose II represents not an endpoint but a new beginning, opening possibilities for additional discoveries that may reshape current knowledge about one of history's most fascinating civilizations. Future archaeological research will undoubtedly benefit from continued technological advancement and international cooperation. Improved dating methods, more sophisticated chemical analysis, and enhanced digital documentation techniques will enable investigation of sites and materials that are currently inaccessible or too fragile for study. The genuine excitement of archaeological discovery, exemplified by finds like Thutmose II's tomb, provides sufficient wonder and intellectual satisfaction without requiring embellishment from speculative theories or manufactured controversies about connections to biblical narratives. In a quiet corner of a university library, a graduate student scrolls through dozens of websites, each claiming to have solved the mystery of the Exodus pharaoh's identity. The theories contradict each other wildly. One site insists that Ramses II was the oppressor who enslaved the Hebrews. Another declares with equal confidence that Amenhotep II fits the biblical description perfectly. A third presents elaborate charts proving that Thutmose III must be the answer. Each argument seems compelling in isolation, supported by carefully selected evidence and presented with scholarly authority. Yet when professional Egyptologists examine these same claims, they find fundamental flaws in methodology, interpretation, and evidence. The disconnect between popular certainty and scholarly skepticism reflects deeper currents in human psychology and culture that go far beyond archaeology or biblical studies. Understanding why myths about the Exodus Pharaoh persist despite repeated debunking requires examining the powerful forces that shape how people process information, form beliefs, and construct meaning from the fragments of ancient history. The human mind evolved to seek patterns and create narratives that make sense of complex information. This cognitive tendency, essential for survival in uncertain environments, becomes problematic when applied to historical evidence that is inherently fragmentary and ambiguous. Ancient Egyptian civilization left behind thousands of inscriptions, artifacts, and architectural monuments, but this vast record still contains enormous gaps. Missing documents, damaged artifacts, and lost sites create spaces that human imagination rushes to fill with plausible reconstructions. When archaeological evidence aligns even partially with cherished religious narratives, the psychological reward is enormous. Finding a tomb that might belong to a biblical pharaoh, discovering an inscription that could reference biblical events, or identifying artifacts that seem to confirm scriptural accounts creates a profound sense of validation. The emotional satisfaction of such connections often overwhelms the careful, critical analysis needed to evaluate whether the evidence actually supports the proposed interpretations. Religious faith adds another powerful dimension to this psychological dynamic. For millions of people across different faith traditions, the Exodus story represents far more than historical narrative. It speaks to fundamental beliefs about divine justice, human freedom, and the relationship between the powerful and the powerless. The story provides a foundational myth that explains not only ancient events but contemporary experiences of oppression and liberation. Finding archaeological proof for these narratives would validate not just historical claims but entire worldviews about the nature of divine intervention in human affairs. The democratization of information through digital technology has created unprecedented opportunities for amateur researchers to access primary sources and contribute to scholarly debates. High-resolution images of ancient artifacts, digitized manuscript collections, and online archaeological databases provide resources that were once available only to professional scholars. This expanded access has enabled genuine contributions from non-academic researchers while also empowering individuals with limited training to develop elaborate theories based on selective interpretation of complex evidence. Social media platforms amplify this dynamic by creating echo chambers where like-minded individuals reinforce each other's beliefs without encountering serious challenges from alternative perspectives. Algorithms designed to increase user engagement tend to show people content similar to what they have previously viewed, creating feedback loops that strengthen existing convictions rather than exposing users to different viewpoints. The result is increasing polarization between communities that trust professional archaeological expertise and those that regard such expertise as biased, incomplete, or deliberately suppressive. The entertainment industry has played a significant role in shaping popular expectations about archaeological discovery and historical confirmation of religious narratives. Movies, television documentaries, and popular books often present archaeology as a process of dramatic revelation where single discoveries provide definitive answers to ancient mysteries. The methodical, gradual accumulation of evidence that characterizes real archaeological research lacks the narrative excitement that captures audience attention and generates commercial success. Documentary productions about biblical archaeology frequently follow predictable formulas that prioritize dramatic storytelling over rigorous analysis. They typically begin with legitimate archaeological discoveries or scholarly debates, establishing credibility through association with genuine research. They then introduce speculative interpretations that go far beyond what the evidence can support, presenting these speculations as logical conclusions rather than hypothetical possibilities. Finally, they dismiss scholarly skepticism as narrow-minded resistance to revolutionary discoveries, positioning amateur investigators as brave truth-tellers challenging corrupt establishments. The production values of such documentaries often rival those of legitimate educational programming, creating visual experiences that seem authoritative and scientific while avoiding the methodological standards that govern academic research. Dramatic music, impressive computer graphics, and authoritative narration combine to create emotional experiences that feel more compelling than careful scholarly analysis with its inevitable uncertainties and qualifications. Cultural reinforcement mechanisms within religious and ideological communities help maintain belief in debunked theories long after they have been debunked, thoroughly refuted by expert analysis. Religious leaders who lack specialized training in archaeology or ancient history may endorse popular theories about biblical confirmation without understanding their scholarly problems. Educational materials produced for religious communities often present amateur archaeological theories alongside established historical facts, creating confusion about the reliability of different types of evidence. The concept of cultural ownership also influences how people respond to archaeological discoveries and interpretations. Communities that regard biblical narratives as foundational to their identity may feel threatened when professional archaeologists suggest that these stories developed through complex processes of oral transmission, literary composition, and theological reflection rather than simple historical recording. The implication that cherished narratives might be more symbolic than literal challenges not only specific beliefs but entire frameworks for understanding cultural heritage and religious authority. Economic incentives within the publishing and media industries favor sensational claims over careful scholarship when competing for public attention. Books promising to reveal the truth about biblical archaeology attract larger audiences than academic studies that acknowledge uncertainty and complexity. Documentary producers seeking television ratings and online views find that dramatic claims about revolutionary discoveries generate more interest than measured presentations of incremental research findings. The asymmetry between careful scholarship and popular speculation creates fundamental challenges for public education about ancient history. Professional archaeologists must acknowledge uncertainty, qualify their conclusions, and present evidence within appropriate scholarly contexts. Amateur theorists can make confident declarations, ignore contradictory evidence, and promise simple answers to complex questions without concern for peer review or methodological standards. Educational institutions have attempted to address these challenges through improved science literacy programs and critical thinking curricula, but they compete against powerful cultural forces that reward certainty over nuance and dramatic narratives over careful analysis. Students often arrive in archaeology courses with firmly established beliefs about biblical confirmation that resist modification through exposure to professional methodology and evidence. The persistence of myths about the Exodus Pharaoh also reflects broader cultural tensions about the authority of expertise in democratic societies. When archaeological conclusions conflict with popular beliefs or religious convictions, some communities respond by rejecting professional scholarship rather than revising their assumptions. The democratization of information access has empowered individuals to become their own researchers and interpreters, but it has not necessarily provided them with the training needed to evaluate complex evidence reliably. Conspiracy thinking provides another mechanism through which debunked theories maintain vitality despite expert refutation. When professional archaeologists consistently reject amateur claims about Exodus Pharaoh identification, believers may interpret this consensus as evidence of institutional bias or deliberate suppression of inconvenient truths. The very fact that trained experts disagree with popular theories becomes proof of their validity in the minds of those predisposed to distrust academic authority. The psychological comfort provided by conspiracy explanations helps maintain belief systems that might otherwise be threatened by contradictory evidence. Rather than accepting that cherished theories might be incorrect, believers can preserve their convictions by attributing expert disagreement to corruption, narrow-mindedness, or hidden agendas. This defensive mechanism protects core beliefs while eliminating the cognitive dissonance that would otherwise result from encountering persuasive contradictory evidence. International conflicts and cultural tensions in the contemporary Middle East add additional complexity to discussions about biblical archaeology and Egyptian history. Political disputes over territorial claims, religious authority, and cultural heritage create environments where archaeological interpretations become entangled with contemporary ideological positions. Evidence that might support particular historical narratives gets evaluated not just on scholarly grounds but also in terms of its implications for current political and religious debates. The globalization of information and the ease of international communication have enabled the worldwide spread of archaeological theories that might once have remained localized within particular cultural communities. Ideas developed in one cultural context can quickly gain international audiences without undergoing the critical evaluation that might expose their scholarly weaknesses. The result is a global marketplace of ideas where compelling narratives compete successfully with careful analysis for public attention and acceptance. Technology continues to transform how people access information about ancient history and archaeology, creating both opportunities and challenges for public understanding. Virtual museum tours, online educational resources, and digital reconstruction projects provide unprecedented access to archaeological discoveries and scholarly research. These same technologies enable the rapid distribution of misinformation and speculative theories that can achieve worldwide circulation before expert responses can be formulated and disseminated. The future of public engagement with archaeological research may depend on developing more effective strategies for communicating the excitement and significance of genuine discoveries, while helping audiences understand why methodological rigor is essential for reliable knowledge about the past. The authentic wonders revealed through careful archaeological investigation need no embellishment from speculative theories or manufactured controversies to capture human imagination and satisfy intellectual curiosity. In a conservation laboratory at Cambridge University's Fitzwilliam Museum, Dr. Helen Strudwick carefully examines a fragment of papyrus under high-powered magnification, searching for traces of ink that might reveal previously unknown details about ancient Egyptian administrative practices. The document, discovered decades ago but only recently subjected to advanced imaging techniques, represents the kind of methodical investigation that characterizes modern archaeological research. Each barely visible mark must be documented, analyzed, and compared with similar materials from other sites before any conclusions can be drawn about its historical significance. This patient, systematic approach to understanding the ancient world stands in stark contrast to the dramatic claims and instant revelations that dominate popular discussions about biblical archaeology. Real progress in identifying historical connections between archaeological evidence and ancient texts requires collaboration across multiple disciplines, each contributing specialized knowledge and methodological expertise to questions that resist simple answers. Egyptology, the study of ancient Egyptian civilization, has evolved dramatically since the early days when European collectors focused primarily on acquiring spectacular artifacts for museum display. Modern Egyptian archaeology integrates linguistic analysis of hieroglyphic and hieratic texts with scientific examination of material remains, environmental reconstruction of ancient landscapes, and anthropological understanding of cultural processes. This interdisciplinary approach recognizes that no single type of evidence can provide complete answers to complex historical questions. Biblical studies, meanwhile, has developed sophisticated methods for analyzing ancient texts that acknowledge their literary, theological, and historical dimensions. Modern biblical scholarship recognizes that ancient religious literature served multiple functions beyond simple historical recording, including theological instruction, community identity formation, and literary artistic expression. Understanding these texts requires attention to their original cultural contexts, their development through processes of oral transmission and editorial revision, and their functions within the communities that preserved and transmitted them. The intersection of these academic disciplines with archaeological investigation creates opportunities for genuine insights into the historical contexts within which biblical narratives developed. But it also requires careful navigation between different types of evidence and analytical methods. Archaeological data can provide information about material conditions, population movements, and cultural interactions that help illuminate the world described in ancient texts. But archaeological evidence rarely provides the kind of specific, detailed information needed to confirm or refute particular events or individuals mentioned in literary sources. Radiocarbon dating has revolutionized archaeological chronology by providing scientific methods for determining the age of organic materials found at ancient sites. Improved calibration techniques now allow dates to be established with margins of error measured in decades rather than centuries, enabling much more precise correlation between archaeological discoveries and proposed historical events. However, radiocarbon dating can only provide approximate timeframes for when organic materials died, not definitive dates for when artifacts were manufactured or sites were occupied. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies have transformed the process of identifying potential archaeological sites without the expense and time required for extensive excavation. These techniques can detect buried structures, disturbed soil patterns, and variations in subsurface composition that indicate human activity from ancient periods. Satellite imagery provides complementary information about landscape features, ancient road networks, and settlement patterns that help archaeologists understand regional contexts for individual discoveries. Digital documentation methods now allow unprecedented precision in recording archaeological discoveries and making them accessible to researchers worldwide. Three-dimensional scanning creates permanent records of artifacts, architectural features, and entire sites that can be studied virtually without risking damage to fragile ancient materials. High-resolution photography captures details that would be invisible to earlier documentation techniques. Online databases enable immediate sharing of research results and collaborative analysis by international teams of specialists. Chemical analysis of ancient materials provides information about trade networks, manufacturing techniques, and environmental conditions that shaped ancient civilizations. Isotope analysis of human remains can reveal information about ancient diets, migration patterns, and population origins. Residue analysis of pottery vessels and storage containers can identify the types of substances they once contained. DNA analysis of organic materials can provide insights into genetic relationships and population dynamics. These technological advances have created new possibilities for investigating questions about ancient population movements and cultural interactions that might relate to biblical narratives about Hebrew origins and Egyptian experiences. However, the same technologies that enable more sophisticated analysis also require more rigorous standards for evaluating evidence and drawing conclusions. The complexity of modern archaeological methodology makes it even more important to maintain appropriate scholarly caution when interpreting discoveries. International cooperation has become essential for archaeological research in regions where ancient civilizations crossed modern national boundaries. The history of ancient Egypt involved extensive interactions with peoples throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, creating archaeological records that can only be understood through collaborative investigation of sites in multiple countries. Political tensions and security concerns in some regions have complicated such cooperation, but digital communication and virtual collaboration have enabled continued scholarly exchange despite practical obstacles. Funding challenges affect all aspects of archaeological research, from initial site surveys through final publication of results. Major excavation projects require substantial financial resources for equipment, personnel, and logistical support over periods that may extend across multiple field seasons. Laboratory analysis of recovered materials often costs more than the original excavation work. Publication of results in peer-reviewed journals and academic books requires additional time and resources that may not be immediately available to research teams. These practical constraints mean that archaeological investigation proceeds much more slowly than popular media coverage suggests, with genuine discoveries emerging through years of patient work rather than dramatic breakthroughs. The gradual accumulation of evidence from multiple sites and sources creates knowledge that is more reliable but less exciting than the instant revelations promised by sensational theories about biblical archaeology. Professional archaeological training emphasizes the importance of maintaining objectivity when investigating sites or artifacts that might relate to religious or ideological questions. Researchers must be prepared to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when the results contradict their personal beliefs or expectations. This commitment to empirical investigation over predetermined conclusions distinguishes legitimate scholarship from advocacy research designed to support particular theological or political positions. Peer review processes within academic archaeology serve as quality control mechanisms that help identify methodological problems, interpretive errors, and unsupported conclusions before research results are published. Multiple experts examine proposed findings, challenge analytical methods, and suggest alternative interpretations that must be addressed before work is accepted for publication. This process, while sometimes lengthy and occasionally contentious, helps ensure that published research meets professional standards for reliability and scholarly rigor. The development of archaeological ethics has created guidelines for responsible research practices that respect the cultural heritage of modern communities while advancing scholarly understanding of ancient civilizations. These ethical frameworks address questions about artifact ownership, site preservation, community involvement in research projects, and appropriate methods for sharing discoveries with both academic and public audiences. Public archaeology initiatives seek to bridge the gap between professional research and popular interest in ancient history by creating educational programs, museum exhibits, and community outreach projects that help non-specialists understand how archaeological knowledge develops and why methodological standards matter. These programs aim to counter misinformation about archaeological discoveries while fostering appreciation for the genuine excitement of careful scholarly investigation. The emergence of citizen science projects in archaeology has created opportunities for non-professional participation in legitimate research activities while maintaining appropriate academic oversight. Volunteers can contribute to data collection, artifact cataloging, and preliminary analysis under the supervision of trained archaeologists. These programs help address labor shortages in archaeological research while providing educational opportunities for people interested in ancient history. Educational technology continues to evolve in ways that may help address challenges in communicating archaeological complexity to general audiences. Virtual reality experiences can provide immersive encounters with ancient sites and artifacts that convey the excitement of discovery while illustrating the careful methods used to interpret archaeological evidence. Interactive databases allow users to explore research results and understand how conclusions develop through the analysis of multiple types of evidence. Future archaeological research will undoubtedly benefit from continued technological advancement, but it will also require sustained commitment to the methodological principles that distinguish reliable scholarship from speculative theorizing. The questions that motivate popular interest in biblical archaeology, such as the identity of the Exodus Pharaoh, may never receive the kind of definitive answers that many seekers hope to find. However, the ongoing investigation of these questions continues to expand understanding of ancient civilizations and their complex relationships with the religious and literary traditions they helped create. The ancient site of Tel el-Daba in the eastern Nile Delta exemplifies how modern archaeological investigation can illuminate historical contexts relevant to biblical narratives without providing simple confirmations or refutations of specific events. Excavations at this site, identified as the ancient city of Avaris, have revealed evidence of a multicultural population during the Second Intermediate Period that included substantial numbers of people from the Levant. The material culture shows influences from Canaan, Syria, and other regions associated with biblical prehistory. These discoveries provide important context for understanding population movements and cultural interactions in the ancient Near East, but they do not prove or disprove particular claims about Hebrew experiences in Egypt. The archaeological evidence reveals complex patterns of migration, cultural exchange, and political change that created conditions under which various types of population movements might have occurred. This kind of contextual information helps scholars understand the historical plausibility of different proposed scenarios without resolving specific questions about individual events or personalities. Similar principles apply to ongoing research at sites throughout Egypt and the Levant that may relate to questions about ancient Israelite origins and Egyptian experiences. Each new discovery adds to the cumulative understanding of ancient Near Eastern civilization while raising new questions that require further investigation. The genuine excitement of archaeological research lies not in finding simple answers to complex questions, but in participating in the gradual expansion of human knowledge about our shared past. Professional archaeologists remain committed to following evidence wherever it leads while maintaining appropriate skepticism about dramatic claims that exceed what current data can support. This commitment serves not only the integrity of scholarship, but also the interests of communities whose religious and cultural traditions are affected by archaeological interpretations. Reliable knowledge about the ancient world, developed through careful investigation and rigorous analysis, provides a firmer foundation for understanding both historical events and their continuing significance than speculation based on wishful thinking or predetermined conclusions. The evening light enters the Egyptian Museum in Cairo like a gentle tide, drifting through tall windows that glow with the colors of a fading sun. Amber and gold spread softly across the stone walls, while long shadows stretch like dark rivers upon the polished floor. The still air hums with the quiet labor of unseen machines that guard against decay, keeping the ancient treasures safe from the touch of time. A visitor stepping into this silence feels as though they have entered another world, a place where centuries fold into moments and the voices of the past wait patiently to be heard. Within these hushed halls lie the preserved forms of kings whose names have echoed across millennia. Here is Ramses II, remembered as Ramses the Great. Here is Amenhotep II, a ruler of war and pride. Here is Thutmose III, a conqueror who stretched Egypt's reach into distant lands. They rest in linen wrappings, their faces fragile yet enduring, their bodies thin but still carrying the dignity of authority. They are both men and monuments, mortals and symbols. To gaze upon them is to feel the closeness of lives lived 3,000 years ago, lives that once commanded armies, raised temples, and directed the fate of countless souls. The air is thick with reverence but also with mystery. Though scholars have studied every inscription, every fragment of pottery, every trace of these reigns, so much remains unknown. The centuries veil details that no research can ever fully restore, and it is within this veil that questions arise, questions that stir the mind and heart alike. Among them is one that has endured longer than most, a question that reaches from the halls of faith into the realm of history. Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? The Exodus story is more than a tale. It is a foundation of memory, a narrative of liberation cherished by countless generations. It speaks of a people enslaved, of plagues that swept across a mighty empire, of a daring flight into the wilderness, and of the long journey toward freedom. Its themes are eternal: oppression and deliverance, suffering and hope, despair and promise. Yet hidden within this story lies the mystery of identity. Was there a Pharaoh who stood against Moses? Was there a king whose pride clashed with divine command? Was there a ruler whose reign was undone by events so extraordinary that they became legend? Many have sought to answer. Some have pointed to Ramses II, whose very name is echoed in the biblical text. Others propose Amenhotep II, whose campaigns filled Egypt with prisoners of war. Still others suggest Thutmose III, the conqueror who reshaped the map of the Near East. Each candidate carries weight. Each reign offers glimpses that resonate with the biblical account. Yet for all the searching, no proof has been found. Archaeology, for all its power, has yielded no certain answer. There is no inscription carved on temple walls that records plagues or rivers turned to blood. No royal chronicle speaks of masses of slaves fleeing into the desert. No tomb shows signs of a ruler struck by sudden disaster. The silence is profound, and yet silence too has meaning. It tells us that history is not always written in stone. It reminds us that memory and story intertwine in ways that leave traces less tangible but no less powerful. Consider Ramses II, whose reign stretched across 6 decades, longer than the span of most lives. His ambition was boundless. He raised temples at Thebes and Abu Simbel, carved his likeness into colossal statues, and commanded that his name be etched upon stone across the land. His capital city, Pi-Ramses, rose upon the fertile fields of the eastern Nile Delta. Some believe this city is the Ramses of Scripture, a connection that tempts both scholars and believers. The ruins of this city still whisper of its former splendor: wide streets, stables for chariots, palaces where wealth glittered in the light of oil lamps. Ramses led armies into battle, clashing with the Hittites at the famous Battle of Kadesh. He returned with captives, swelling Egypt's population with men and women taken from distant lands. These captives joined the great labor force that fed his ambition, raising stones, carving reliefs, and shaping the monuments he demanded. If Hebrews were among them, they were one group among many, bound together by conquest. His monuments, however, do not speak of disaster. They tell instead of triumph, of victory, of the strength of his arm and the glory of his reign. His mummy rests in solemn stillness, its features lined with age but bearing no trace of divine punishment. If Ramses was the pharaoh of Exodus, then history has chosen to remain silent on that chapter of his life. When the reign of Ramses the Great finally ended, Egypt did not fall into silence. Another pharaoh, Amenhotep II, rose to power. His reign was marked by pride in war, by campaigns that reached across the Levant, and by boasts carved into stone. He claimed to have taken more than 100,000 captives in a single expedition, a number so immense it strains belief. Kings of Egypt often spoke with exaggeration, turning victories into legends. Yet even so, his claims reveal a world shaken by upheaval. Entire families, whole villages, were uprooted and carried away into bondage. These captives, men and women from distant cities, became the laborers of Egypt. They worked in the fields, they carried stones for construction, they bent their backs to the endless rhythm of toil. We see their faces even now painted in the tomb of his official Rekhmir. There on the plaster walls, foreign workers are shown kneading clay, shaping bricks, stacking them beneath the hot Egyptian sun, while overseers stand watchful and stern. To look upon these images is to feel the weight of their burden, a burden that mirrors the description of Hebrew slaves in Exodus. The parallel is striking, but it is not proof, for these were not Hebrews alone, but many peoples caught in the net of empire. The tomb painting is a window into reality, not into a single story. Amenhotep ruled with firmness. He led his armies with ruthless determination. He filled Egypt with prisoners who became the workforce behind temples, monuments, and agricultural wealth. And yet, as with Ramses, the silence in his records is telling. His inscriptions celebrate his victories. They describe the spoils of war and the captives paraded before him. They do not speak of plagues. They do not mention rivers that ran red, skies filled with locusts, or the sudden loss of slaves fleeing into the desert. His reign ended not in calamity, but in continuity. Egypt remained strong, its empire intact. His burial place in the Valley of the Kings adds another layer to the story. Amenhotep was laid to rest with care and ceremony, as was fitting for a ruler believed to stand close to the gods. Centuries later, when thieves threatened the peace of royal tombs, priests gathered his body along with the bodies of other kings and hid them together in secret chambers to keep them safe. To early discoverers, this clustering of mummies seemed strange, even ominous, as though disaster had struck the dynasty. But closer study revealed another truth. It was not catastrophe, but devotion. It was the hands of priests, not the hand of plague, that placed them side by side. Amenhotep's body, like those of his royal kin, bears no sign of sudden or violent death. The linen wrappings whisper of reverence, not of divine punishment. Still, the memory of his reign lingers with particular force, for the images of forced labor etched in tomb walls and the tales of captives by the tens of thousands create a backdrop that feels uncannily close to the Exodus story. His Egypt was indeed an empire of bondage, an empire where foreign peoples were absorbed into the service of Pharaoh, their sweat and toil turned into stone monuments that endured through centuries. If Hebrews were among those countless captives, their cries would have been lost in a sea of suffering, indistinguishable to the scribes who recorded the king's glory. And yet, absence of record is not absence of reality. Ancient kings did not record their defeats, only their triumphs. They did not carve humiliations into stone, only victories. If disaster struck, the silence of official inscriptions would be expected. This truth complicates the search, for even as we find no mention of plagues or exodus in Amenhotep's reign, we must remember that Egyptian records were not mirrors of reality, but instruments of power. They were meant to project strength, not weakness. What they choose not to say may be as important as what they declare. The mystery deepens when we step back to look at the world of the 18th dynasty, the dynasty of which Amenhotep was a part. This was a period when Egypt reached out with vigor into foreign lands. Campaigns across Canaan and Syria brought not only tribute but captives who filled Egypt's storehouses and workshops. It was a time of glory for the empire, but also a time of upheaval for the peoples who lay beyond its borders. Entire communities could vanish in a single campaign, their inhabitants forced into the land of the Nile, where their identities were absorbed or erased. For those who survived, the memory of such displacements could become the seed of stories handed down in whispers and songs. It is in this setting that the Exodus story could have been born, not as a precise chronicle, but as a memory of oppression, woven into a narrative of liberation. Amenhotep's reign, with its boasts of captives and images of forced labor, provides a historical canvas upon which such memories could be painted. Yet it remains a canvas, not the painting itself. The details of Exodus cannot be pinned to him with certainty. His tomb is silent, his mummy rests in peace, his monuments stand as testaments to strength, not to downfall. And so the question lingers, unresolved. Was Amenhotep the pharaoh of Exodus? The evidence neither confirms nor denies. It leaves us in the realm of possibility, where echoes are heard but identities remain hidden. The silence of his tomb, the silence of his inscriptions, the silence of archaeology itself, all join together in a chorus that is at once frustrating and humbling. For in that silence lies a truth older than any single story, that history is not always written for us to read, and that sometimes what we most long to know remains beyond our reach. Long before Amenhotep, there was another king whose name looms large in the memory of Egypt. Thutmose III reigned in the 18th dynasty, a warrior whose skill and vision expanded Egypt's empire far beyond the Nile Valley. He has often been called the Napoleon of Egypt, not for height or form, but for the scope of his campaigns. His armies marched again and again into the lands of Canaan and Syria. City after city fell before him. Tributes flowed from conquered lands. Captives were carried in long lines back to Egypt, their lives forever changed by the power of Pharaoh. The records of Thutmose speak not only of conquest but of administration. He was not content simply to win battles. He reshaped the lands he conquered, placing them under Egyptian oversight, ensuring that their wealth was drawn into the empire's coffers. On temple walls at Karnak, his deeds are carved in rows upon rows of hieroglyphs, detailing victories, spoils, and tribute. These inscriptions reveal the machinery of empire, the careful accounting of grain, livestock, metals, and human lives. They show us a ruler whose reach extended across deserts and seas, binding distant peoples into the fabric of Egypt's wealth. In such a reign, where entire populations were displaced, one can imagine how memories of migration and exile might have been born. A group carried away might remember their bondage, their cries rising above the sound of whips and hammers. Over generations, those memories could take on new form, woven into songs and stories that gave meaning to suffering. Perhaps it is here, in the shadow of Thutmose's triumphs, that some of the threads of Exodus were spun. And yet, as always, there is no certainty. His monuments declare conquest, not disaster. His tomb lies in the Valley of the Kings, silent, bearing no marks of plagues or defeat. If he was the pharaoh of Exodus, history has chosen to hide it. Centuries later, another voice of stone would speak, a voice unearthed in the year 1896 by Flinders Petrie. It was the Meneptah Stele, a block of granite carved with an inscription that has echoed across the study of history and scripture. Among its lines is a simple statement, stark and direct. It proclaims that Israel is laid waste, its seed no more. These words, carved in the 13th century before the Common Era, are the earliest mention of Israel outside the Bible. They tell us that by the year 1208 before the Common Era, a people known as Israel was already living in the highlands of Canaan. The stele is both treasure and puzzle. It anchors Israel in history, proving their existence at a time when doubts might otherwise arise. Yet it says nothing of Exodus. It speaks of defeat, not liberation. It gives us a name but not a story. To hold it in mind is to grasp a fragment of truth that refuses to complete the whole picture. Like a single star seen in the night sky, it confirms that light exists but does not show us the shape of the constellation. Archaeology of Canaan offers further fragments. In the 13th and 12th centuries before the Common Era, new settlements began to appear in the highlands. They were small, modest, their houses simple, often built around courtyards with low stone walls. Their pottery was plain, functional rather than ornate. Their way of life was different from the wealthy cities of the plains, suggesting communities of herders and farmers who had settled into new rhythms. These villages grew in number, spreading across the hills. Some scholars see in these settlements the early Israelites. They note the distinct pottery styles, the absence of pig bones among the remains, the patterns of household structure that differ from neighboring peoples. Yet the story these settlements tell is one of gradual growth, not sudden invasion. They suggest a people forming an identity over time, not arriving all at once from a dramatic exodus. They may have been locals who shifted from nomadic life into settled communities. They may have included small groups of outsiders who joined them. The truth seems to lie in a slow weaving together of many threads. And yet within such weaving, memories of bondage could still play a role. A story of slavery in Egypt could have traveled with a small group, its power growing as it was retold and reimagined. In time, that story could become central, transformed into the grand narrative of Exodus. Archaeology cannot prove this, but it does not need to. The emergence of Israel in Canaan is complex, layered, and full of mystery. Exodus may reflect not a single event but the collective memory of generations. What remains clear is that no ruler of Egypt can be named with certainty as the Pharaoh of Exodus. The tombs of Ramses, Amenhotep, and Thutmose are silent. The inscriptions of Egypt boast of triumphs, not defeats. The stones of Canaan reveal growth, not sudden conquest. The Merneptah stele speaks of Israel, but not of their beginnings. In this silence, we are reminded that history and story are not the same, and that sometimes the truths we seek are not written in stone, but carried in memory, song, and faith. Archaeology continues its patient dialogue with the past. Each season brings new discoveries from beneath the desert sands and the highland soil. Potsherds lie buried for millennia and then emerge, carrying the faint trace of hands that once shaped them. Tombs long sealed yield treasures that speak of ritual and reverence. Inscriptions reveal the voice of kings long gone, their boasts still echoing even though the empires they commanded have turned to dust. Every new find is a fragment, a clue, a whisper of life lived long ago. And yet, even as discoveries multiply, the great question remains unanswered. No fragment has yet revealed the name of the Exodus Pharaoh. The tools of modern science sharpen our gaze. High-resolution imaging reveals faded signs invisible to the eye. Chemical analysis uncovers the origins of pigments, metals, and clays. Three-dimensional scanning allows us to walk through tombs that have remained closed to the world for thousands of years. These technologies pull back the veil of time, offering wonders our ancestors could scarcely imagine. But the past is not always willing to give up its secrets. For every answer unearthed, a dozen mysteries remain. In this way, archaeology mirrors the human heart, always yearning, always questioning, never fully at rest. The story of Exodus endures not because it is confirmed by stone, but because it speaks to something beyond stone. It is the memory of a people who faced bondage and dreamed of freedom. It is the cry of those who suffered, transformed into a song of hope. It is the reminder that oppression does not define destiny, that even in the grip of empire, a vision of deliverance can take root and flourish. That vision shaped the identity of a people. It has shaped faith for millennia. It continues to shape imaginations today. And so we walk once more in thought through the hushed halls of the Egyptian Museum. We pause before the still form of Ramses, before the wrapped body of Amenhotep, before the silent tomb of Thutmose. We look into the faces of kings who once believed themselves eternal, and we wonder, was it you, Ramses, who stood defiant before Moses? Was it you, Amenhotep, whose boasts of captives echo so strangely with the story of Exodus? Was it you, Thutmose, whose conquests sowed the seeds of memory that grew into legend? The silence of their faces gives no answer. Their wrappings conceal more than their bodies. They conceal the truth of the story we seek. Perhaps the answer has been with us all along. The Pharaoh of Exodus may never be named. His tomb may never be identified. His body may rest in quiet anonymity among those who lie in glass cases and hidden chambers. The story does not require his name. Its power does not rest upon the certainty of archaeology. Its strength lies in the way it has spoken to generations, in the way it has given meaning to suffering and hope to those who longed for deliverance. The sands of Egypt guard their secrets well. The stones of Canaan whisper in fragments. The inscriptions of kings boast but do not confess. The silence may endure forever. Yet within that silence we find another kind of truth. For sometimes the greatest discoveries are not the ones that reveal a name or a date. Sometimes they are the ones that teach us to listen differently, to honor what cannot be proved, to respect the boundary between history and faith. As night settles over Cairo, the museum grows quiet. The mummies rest, their linen wrappings glowing faintly in the soft light. The visitor leaves, stepping out into the warm air of the city, carrying with them not the certainty of answers, but the wonder of questions. The search continues as it always will across deserts and archives, across digs and dreams. The story remains, not diminished by the silence of archaeology, but enriched by it. For in the end, the mystery itself becomes part of the gift. The greatest discovery may not be the tomb, but learning to separate longing from evidence, honoring mystery while pursuing truth.